Hello and welcome to this week's Why Football podcast with me, Michael Dryden and Etches Adokwu. This week, Etches will be talking all about the links between dementia and heading footballs in the modern game. Before we start, please follow us on Twitter at YFootball_ for our latest content. Please also follow and subscribe with us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Acast, and new for this week, YouTube, for immediate access to future episodes. Etches, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Trident. Also, how exciting is that? YouTube added to the list for...
Came a long way.
We have come a long way indeed. Back from the days when it was just Spotify and formerly SoundCloud, which has been laid to rest. To now have YouTube on there is pretty good. So it'd be good to see the episode on there. I'm well, thank you, Dryden. Not much to report, obviously, with the lockdown happening. But I think I dropped a poll on Twitter a few days ago, which was, should Mauricio Pochettino take over at Man United? Where'd you stand on that one?
Well, there's been a lot of talk recently in the press about Solskjaer and whether or not he should stay. Obviously, Mourinho got a lot of criticism at his time at United because United tend to spend a lot of money on players, as do a lot of Premier League clubs, and their results on the pitch and the league table in recent years have not properly matched up to the amount they've spent and where the club should be and has been historically. Is Mauricio Pochettino coming in going to change their fortunes in the short term? Probably not, but he did build a bit of a dynasty at Tottenham. They didn't have too much domestic success in terms of silverware, but he transformed the team and arguably the club into what they are today, which is a completely different outfit to the one that perhaps we saw Redknapp manage and Juan de Ramos and some of them predecessors. How about you, Etches? What do you think?
As an Arsenal fan, no, because I want to see Man United struggle for as long as possible, for the greater good of Manchester United fans and for their former success and heights, yes, because I don't think, as funny as #Ollie at the wheel is, I don't think he's the right man to steer them forward. How are you, Dryden?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I bought my first pay-per-view game last night, Brighton versus Burnley. It was a 0-0 draw, so well worth the £15. It's been quite controversial in the press recently about whether or not we should be charging, or Premier League clubs should be charging additional monies on top of the Sky and BT packages to watch fixtures. I think it should be free ahead of that because the league has already squeezed out so much money from fans as it is. Never mind the additional amounts on top of that during lockdown and when people have arguably less money. So yeah, and aside from that, I turned 27 on Wednesday, so an absolutely terrible time to have a birthday. And just, not getting any younger. So it's just a bit of a depressing time.
27?
Yeah, wrong side of 25.
Yeah, indeed. So for your birthday, can you ask for some new trainers? Your trainer games.
I've actually ordered some new trainers, actually. They arrive on Monday. So if anyone wants to see a picture of them, please let me know. I will send them a DM with a thank you message.
No, thank God for that. Right, good. It's good to hear.
So, Etches, why this topic?
Sad passing of Nobby Stiles, one of the 66 heroes. Loads of media outlets did a lot to shine on his achievements in the game and how much he did and all of the positive things that he did. So David Beckham came out, as well as Gary Neville, to talk about that and said how influential he was for them. But there is a worrying number of England's famous 66 winners to have succumbed to brain conditions such as dementia and memory loss, with some of the footballers also having conditions like CTE. To go into more details, from that victorious World Cup winning squad, 5 members are known to have had some form of brain condition, with Jack Charlton, who unfortunately is no longer with us, Nobby Stiles, Martin Peters, Bobby Charlton and Ray Wilson, all known to be suffering from dementia when they're alive or currently now. Stiles' son, in an interview with the ABC, claimed that those 5 were one of many in the actual squad who are suffering from some form of actual brain condition, which is an alarming number of people, and it's much higher than the average population. I think it's one of those things where a lot of pros then and scientists have associated these brain conditions to heading footballs, which back then were much firmer and tougher than the modern football. However, it doesn't really work that way, because we still in today's game have children as young as 6 heading footballs. And even though the footballs are much lighter, there's a worry that, that constant repetition is potentially damaging those people as they grow up and can lead to conditions further down the line. Science says that the human skull is not fully developed in children to the age of 20. And there's a belief that, constantly heading balls can hamper the brain's development. So I wanted to do a podcast looking at the risks of heading footballs and looking to see whether players are in fact safe.
I mean, football in England and the world has changed drastically, probably from the mid 20th century. I mean, in England, the idea of the position of maximum opportunity was popularised by Charles Hughes, former director of coaching for the FA. This idea involved getting the ball in the penalty area as quickly and as frequently as possible. So that would often be done airily. So the ball would be put into the box. There'd be a lot of players in the box who'd be contending for that ball, which leads to a lot of physical activity. It leads to a lot of heading, which is fundamental in the game and has been fundamental in the game for a number of years and more so in the past. However, now even in England, you'd say youth football focuses far more on technical attributes, small-sided matches, and less physical elements of the game. So hopefully this helps mitigate the risk to youth that you rightly mentioned. Professional football is also probably far less aerial and physical than it once was, albeit football philosophies do change frequently, and who knows, Diceball could return to the top once again. So what actually is dementia?
Yeah, dementia describes different brain disorders that trigger a loss of brain function. That's straight from Wikipedia, that one. So that's my fun fact from there. So these conditions are usually progressive and eventually become quite severe. So Alzheimer's disease, which is mentioned quite a lot, is the most common type of dementia, which affects roughly 50 to 75% of those people who are diagnosed. There are other types as well, like vascular dementia and frontotemporal dementia as well. And some of the symptoms of dementia include memory loss, confusion, problems with speech and understanding. And unfortunately, dementia is a terminal condition.
I mean, almost all of us have friends or family who are directly affected by dementia or know someone who is. It's affected various elderly members of my family over the years. And as we get older and as the population gets older and people live longer, it's actually something that is becoming more of a factor, more of an issue in the health system, which is a sad and a cruel fact. And I think one that we actually might see more prominent in ex-footballers as well. So what do we know about dementia and footballers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Currently, we don't know a great deal, but a recent report back in October 2019 states that footballers are 3.5 times more likely to have dementia compared to the general population, which is such a headline statement.
Yeah.
And a very worrying statistic. Back in 2002, former West Brom striker Jeff Assel died at 59 and was known to be suffering from early onset dementia. During his playing days, Assel was known to be an exceptional header of the ball and scored many headed goals. However, once his playing days were over, he was diagnosed with dementia and would later die. The coroner said in his report that minor repeated traumas to the head had caused his death. A re-examination of his brain in 2014 actually found that he had CTE, which is a brain condition normally linked to boxing and other physical contact sports. It's quite worrying to hear something like that because to get CTE in a sport like football really is astonishing. In the popular documentary series looking into the death of Aaron Hernandez, it was on Netflix. Don't know if you watched it. He had that. And at the time of his death, he was severely suffering from it, which meant that he was having bouts of psychosis and impulsive behavior. But, NFL is a very highly physical sport, as are sports like boxing and NFL and rugby. So for it to be present in a former footballer is very concerning indeed. Even for players such as Bobby Charlton, who very recently revealed his condition that he has dementia. He wasn't known throughout the game to be a massive header of the ball, but obviously for him to use that action consistently throughout the years, even though it may be a lot less than some of his counterparts, it's sad to see that obviously there may be a link between heading and in fact these type of conditions.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that Bobby actually has suffered or does suffer from dementia. I know it was something that affected his brother Jack, his late brother Jack, and has affected a lot of that 66 team, but that's certainly news to me.
Yeah, it's something which came out really, really recently. I think there is a documentary being released, and his family felt it was okay for the public to know. So
Mm.
hopefully, um, obviously it's terminal illness, but it's unfortunate that that's happened to him. I think it's also difficult to just draw conclusions and say heading equals
Yeah.
dementia. It's also worth noting that that squad back then were heading much heavier footballs, which when they got wet got even heavier. So, how can you compare that to today's game? In today's game, balls are much lighter. So it is the risk of heading and dementia solely for that era, or is the risk still relevant today? And as I just touched on before, it's not solely to do with heading. There are other factors as well. So are they smokers?
Yep.
Are they drinking too much alcohol? Are they overweight? There's loads of other factors which actually, dictate whether someone can develop that condition or not.
Yeah, and if you apply the logic around the weight of the ball, the hardness of the ball that you just touched on, and then you apply that to, say, the modern footballer whose diet is absolutely completely different to what it would have been in the 60s or the 70s or even the 80s, where now is the body of a professional footballer is under the microscope and is fine-tuned in all aspects to produce elite performance on the pitch. So, will we see, Man City are pioneers in physiology and diet in the game in the Premier League? Will we see Premier League players, some of the defenders for Manchester City, for example, will, in 50 years' time, will they be, or 40 years' time, will they suffer from these sort of illnesses, these sort of afflictions? It's not so certain, but there's so many variables, like you say.
Yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? It's this massive unknown. The effects take such a long time for them to show up, and the game, as you said, is rightly changing. So we've gone from changing footballs to then we started changing diet, as you said, and diet will probably change some more, and footballs will change some more. So is it something which was specifically for that era, which isn't really as relevant now, or is the risk still there? Only time will really tell.
Mm. So how have nations reacted to growing concerns?
Yeah, so some nations have taken this report that came out very seriously, and other reports in the past. This year, Scotland became the first European country to ban heading for under 12s in Europe, citing that scientific evidence was one of the main reasons for this change. So the SFA stated that a report highlighted that players that were heading old-style footballs could be more at risk from the disease. But based off the information, they've still decided to impose the ban for under 12s, which I find interesting because what you're basically saying is, okay, there's a link between old-style footballs and heading to dementia, but there's still that grey area over what does that mean for today's footballers?
Yeah.
Does that then mean is the risk even higher because the football may be lighter, but let's say you hit it with more power or something. It is interesting that they opted to do that, and also why under 12s, why not under 13s, 14s, 15s? It's a really interesting move from Scotland, and it'd be interesting to see what other countries do in the near future.
Absolutely.
Former Spurs and England midfielder Ryan Mason, who was forced to retire from a skull fracture he sustained in a clash of heads, suggested that youth players should use sponge balls rather than actual balls to practice heading technique, which is an interesting proposition. You know what that reminds you of? Did you ever do Cubs when you were younger?
Yes.
Or
Yeah,
Beavers?
I did. Yeah, the Beavers.
Yeah. You always used to play with sponge footballs.
The worst ones were them giant tennis ball footballs. They were just so frustrating to play with. I'd rather play with a sponge ball because at least you can giant balls. And the thing was, they were terrible for kicking with, but they were also solid. So they're probably harder than a football.
But yeah, it is an interesting proposition, but I'm not too sure that'll become mainstream. Firstly, because how does that work for academies using sponge balls outside? But we'll wait and see how that one goes. The PFA have also called for restrictions on young players heading footballs until more is known about the long-term health risks of the action, which is interesting. Professionals on brain injuries, have also chipped into the debate, with one of the world's leading expert on brain injuries, Dr. Bennett Amulu, recently saying he thought heading a football should be restricted into the professional game and banned for under 18s. That's a long time.
Yeah, it is. And it's
very long time.
It's a tough one because if you ban heading in the game for under 18s, it's just going to phase heading out of the game. And I'm not got any strong opinions for or against whether or not it's a completely separate argument. It's probably a separate topic is whether or not heading should be banned from the game. to an extent, and whether the game could exist without it. But if someone grows up learning to play the game, plays football, and doesn't header the ball in a competitive game or in any fixture until they're 18, unless it's a sponge ball in training, it's just going to come out of the game. They're not going to start heading the ball in competitive games, are they? The way they behave as players is going to be completely. And maybe that'll provide a better game. Maybe it'll provide a quicker, more technical game. Who knows? I'm not really arguing we should have no heading in the game, but I just think with that sort of implementation, it's just going to face heading out of the game, and probably the complete physical side of it, which a lot of people do enjoy.
Yeah, Jerome, you're very pro long ball football, aren't you?
No, I'm trying to ban heading, mate. I talked about Dyche ball earlier in the podcast. I'm a big fan, but no, I mean, watching Dyche last night at Brighton versus Burnley, they do very much still play kind of a long ball, get the ball to the strike of quite early doors in the air, and some teams do still play with it, still do enjoy and do still play with direct forms of the game, and so removing the aerial. Kind of almost the aerial ball, is that even going to be possible? Probably not.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. Moving back on to how people have responded in the game, the US have also put in a ban on heading since 2015, where under 11s can't head footballs, with restrictions on under 13s. I actually couldn't find what the restriction is. So under 11s can't, like, full stop. But under 13s, there's restrictions. So what is it? You can't head the ball if it's what, like?
Well, I'll tell you what I'll put a stop to, which I'm very much in favour of. Is, you know, when you used to play in the park, or used to even just play at school, and someone would go around the keeper and get on the floor and head the ball over the line from the floor. I know it's not an aerial challenge, but that needs to stop. And so if that is involved in these restrictions, then I will completely welcome it.
Someone's done that to you in the past, haven't they?
Yep.
Interestingly, aside from all of this, the English FA don't currently believe there's enough evidence to suggest banning heading would actually benefit players' well-being. The Football Association have actually said it's committed to researching and examining all areas of head injuries in the game, including the long-term effects on players. An FA spokesperson actually said, "We've commissioned comprehensive and rigorous research studies in this area in collaboration with the Drake Foundation and the PFA, which are currently ongoing. These studies will help us establish whether or not there are any risks associating with playing football."
Well, I feel as if any sort of approach to this, and it's difficult, I know it's a huge sport with a lot of different governing bodies across the world, but you think it needs to be a unified FIFA initiative across the globe, because I mean, you've got the safety of kids, of the professionals, and also those that are retirees. But then obviously the way in which you alter youth football obviously has an effect on different nations and how they're brought up playing football. So if you've got, if some extreme measures brought in where under 18s can head the ball in a certain country, for example, but in another country it was under 11s, well, that's going to have a profound effect on how, the football develops in both them countries. So I feel as if it needs to be kind of a uniform approach across the board, which again is difficult, but I just think something that FIFA need to lead. And it doesn't necessarily surprise me as well that the FA aren't basically coming out with, and I imagine the Premier League would also be a governing body that would, or an organisation that would be probably hesitant to make any sort of comment on this, because changing the game as it is can be quite unpopular. Seen what happened with VAR, and for the FA and the Premier League, for them it's largely about protecting the game as it is, protecting the Premier League, protecting investment.
Yeah, I think the problem with a FIFA-led initiative is it's not a priority as a. I always find with something like this, because of the length of time it takes for it to appear in certain footballers, people just don't care enough. Some of these great heroes that we're talking about aren't relevant anymore. They're not important. They're no longer assets.
Yeah. No, agreed.
Bobby Charlton is arguably one of England's greatest ever players, but he's no longer the asset. If Wayne Rooney came down tomorrow and had dementia, there'd be a huge uproar because he is still an asset. He's not as valuable as he once was, but he's still very important in the media's eye line. Whereas I think for those guys, they're old, they're retired, people put it down to old age and other factors, so they're kind of forgotten about. So FIFA kind of just see it in the backlog. I think their main aim is to deliver World Cups and obviously to look at VAR and changing rules and that sort of stuff. And it's a shame, but the focus needs to be on that, because we're talking about the well-being of human beings, whether they're assets or not. it's still really important to kind of get to the bottom of it, and to see where it shapes the game. We talk about Dyche before. That will. Sorry, Sean Dyche, in case he ever tunes in, but it is a style of football which isn't particularly popular or pleasing on the eye, but it will always exist. It always will do. It may not exist anymore on the top flight, but it will further down, and vice versa. It may have its heyday coming back in 20 or 30 years' time. Football goes in cycles. So this whole heading business with dementia is quite tricky, because I just can't see a scenario where if we ban heading for under 18s, heading could go out of the game. And I think there are too many people that wouldn't want to see that.
No, agreed. Either way, a solution needs to be found, or some kind of restriction. I think it's clear that there is a link. Otherwise, nations like Scotland wouldn't be putting in these sort of restrictions. So, on that note, Etches, what new studies are underway in this particular field?
Well, the University of East Anglia, which you and I know very well. For those of you that don't know, me and Dryden both studied at the University of East Anglia, and they're currently looking into the cognitive changes that occur due to concussions and head injuries in former footballers. The university stated that recent research has highlighted an increased risk in dementia in ex-professional footballers. But at the moment, we don't know what this cause of association is. It's not currently very clear. So it's quite interesting how they're trying to do some research looking into that, trying to answer those unanswered questions currently. So it'll be interesting to see how that study goes. I think that started in January. There have been calls for the FA to get involved to help fund the study, but it's unclear whether they actually have. The landmark study I mentioned to you before was only released in October last year. Obviously, from October to now, we've hit a massive pandemic, which has probably halted a lot of these types of studies. And I expect more to kind of come up in the near future, especially as, more and more of our old footballing heroes succumb to these conditions and illnesses. I think that the general interest of the public will rise, the awareness will rise, and people will, do more to try and get more studies up and going.
I mean, I know I was skeptical earlier about the FA and Premier League and even FIFA in terms of are they going to want to change the norm, because currently they're making a lot of money out of the game. But as you've highlighted there, I mean, actually finding a definitive link between football, how the game is played, heading the footballs, and the onset of a condition years down the line, maybe in the future when we have a larger sample of data, bigger pool of people involved, you can start to make bigger links. But as you pointed out, it's almost impossible to make that link at this stage. So, is acting now premature? Well, we don't know enough about it, or is it necessary? Where I think football is unique in this argument is that the head is actually used as a means of play. So it's in rugby, in NFL, the head is in contact all the time with people, but it's not actually a means of, say, making contact with the ball. It's not actually a recognised form of actually playing the game. Whereas in football, it is actually a fundamental part. If you're a centre back, a fundamental part of your game is your ability to hit the football when it's coming down from the air at pace, when it's coming towards you at pace from someone's boot. If you're a striker, it's the same sort of thing, trying to hit it on goal. You're making contact with the goalkeeper. He's got his hands in around your head. This is unique to the game, and so it might be something that needs to be prioritised in football, and hopefully it can become a pioneer in it as we start to see more and more ex-pros succumb to this illness.
So to kind of round things off, is answering that question really, which is heading safe in the modern game? And looking at the research, it's a difficult question to properly answer. I think football's in a place where there's a general acceptance that there's a link between football and conditions like dementia, but not enough evidence to suggest that the modern game needs more action. Clearly, countries like Scotland and the US think that more needs to be done to protect players. But, others are skeptical that, these effects kind of affect older players only and not the younger generations. Like England, they're kind of in a way where they're thinking, well, we also believe there's a link, but, we need more research, we need more evidence. Ryan Mason, as I mentioned earlier, consistently has said that heading a ball at a young age can't be healthy. And I think I mentioned at the very beginning that with the adult skull not fully forming until they're around the age of 20, there is that argument where even though modern balls are lighter, it can't be healthy for 6, 7, 8 year olds to be heading a ball on a constant basis. And if those young players end up becoming the pros that we know today, like Calvert-Lewin, a fantastic header of the ball, is his well-being? Have we protected him as best as we can? I think one thing football has done very well, in particular in England, they've been taking head injuries more seriously, especially with concussions. The protocols that have been brought in place have been fantastic, and most clubs have, adhered to them. There's been a few examples where some managers have tried to get around that, but generally it's been much better. But the same seriousness needs to be applied with the long-term health effects of head trauma, such as dementia and Alzheimer's, etc. And once football manages to do that, then I think we can really, really see some progress. I think the issue comes down to time. These studies take a very long time to actually look into. The likes of Shearer, Lineker, Gary Neville, maybe to a certain extent. It'd be interesting to see if those players be willing to take part in potential research, so we could kind of get to see how it affects more modern footballers. But I think if action is taken sooner, then the well-being of future generations and generations after that will be much better.
And on your point about the footballs, while footballs are lighter, the game is actually played at a far quicker pace than what it was back in those times, or back in maybe the mid 20th century. And also players are striking the ball harder and are taught to strike the ball harder because techniques have came a long way. You have coaches for individual elements of the game now. You have an attacking coach. You have someone who's specialised in striking football, for example. I think there's a lot of variables here, but I think we shouldn't just look at the game now and think, well, these players are fitter, healthier, the mental state's perhaps better, the football's lighter, and just assume that because all these safety measures are in and around that, no, this is not an issue that will affect the modern player or the modern game, when in fact, years down the line, they could reveal that actually it does. Right, well, that's all from us. Thank you, Etches, for your insight there on dementia in the modern game. I hope we see some breakthroughs in the near future. And please tune in next week. And thank you all, guys, for listening. Cheers.
Cheers, guys.